When we talk about cold cases, we often think about, dusty files and forgotten leads. But this case, the disappearance of Bob Chapel in Tasmania, it's anything but cold. This one's been simmering for years.
It really has. Full of twists and turns and conflicting evidence, really. It keeps you guessing the whole time.
And debate. There's been a lot of that.
Oh, yeah.
For our listener who might not be familiar with this case, let's set the scene a little bit.
Oh.
Imagine Hobart, Tasmania.
Yeah.
Beautiful city, vibrant waterfront community in Sandy Bay. And that's where Bob Chapel, a well-respected physicist nearing retirement, lived with his partner, Sue Neal Fraser. And they had recently purchased a beautiful yacht, the Four Winds, dreaming of sailing off into the sunset right. But their story takes a very dark turn on Australia Day 2009.
It does, and the setting itself, I think, plays a role here. Sandy Bay, where the Four Winds was moored, is an affluent area known for its pretty tight-knit community of sailing enthusiasts, and this makes the crime even more shocking because it really disrupts that perceived safety and tranquility of this very idyllic location.
Like something right out of a crime novel, right?
Yeah.
This perfect life. And then suddenly a disappearance. So Bowie decides to spend the night on the Four Winds, doing some repairs, while Sue heads back to shore. Seems like a normal evening.
Yeah.
But the next morning, everything changes.
Yeah. She tries to contact Bob, but there's no answer. And then she receives a call from the police, informing her that the Four Winds has been found partially submerged. And get this.
Sabotaged.
Sabotaged. Okay. Now that definitely pushes this beyond a simple missing persons case. What kind of sabotage are we talking about?
So picture this. A crucial pipe had been cut. A seacock, which is essentially a valve that lets water in and out of the hull, was left open. And the pumps and alarms, which are the systems that are designed to prevent the yacht from sinking, were deactivated. So it was really a deliberate and calculated effort to sink the boat.
So from a peaceful evening to a deliberately sunken yacht, it's clear that the police had a potential crime scene on their hands. What did the initial investigation reveal? Well, they found traces of blood on the deck, but no sign of Bob. Adding to the mystery, several items were missing. A fire extinguisher, an EPIRB, which is an emergency beacon, and oddly enough, some squares of carpet. So this suggested that someone might have been trying to clean up evidence.
Okay, so we've got a missing person, signs of a struggle, a sabotaged yacht, and missing items that could be evidence. Sounds like the investigators had their work cut out for them. Did they have any early leads or suspects?
Well, they immediately focused on inconsistencies in Sue Neal Fraser's account of the night that Bob disappeared.
Okay.
For example, she got stingy, but there were witnesses who contradicted that, saying that they had seen him using it pretty skillfully just days before.
So right from the start, Sue's statements are raising some red flags for the investigators. It's like every detail they uncover seems to make her story less believable.
Exactly. And things become even more suspicious when they find a red jacket near the scene, which, despite her initial denials, turned out to belong to Sue. This, coupled with some gaps in her alibi, really put her in the spotlight.
Gaps in her alibi. Like, what kind of gaps are we talking about? This is where it starts to feel like a true crime documentary, right?
Oh, it does. For instance, she claimed to have been at a Bunnings warehouse that afternoon, but CCTV footage showed she wasn't there. And then there was a late-night phone call that she struggled to explain. And even CCTV footage of her car near the yacht club around midnight, which contradicted her claim of being at home all night.
Oh, wow. So her alibi's falling apart and there's physical evidence linking her to the scene. This is not looking good for Sue. What was her explanation for all of this?
Well, she claimed that the inconsistencies were just due to stress and confusion, which, is understandable given the circumstances.
Of course.
She also floated a theory that the yacht might have been used for drug smuggling without her knowledge, suggesting that someone else might have been involved, and Bob stumbled onto something dangerous.
Drug smuggling. That's a pretty dramatic twist. Did the police find any evidence to support that theory?
They didn't. The yacht was too damaged to be thoroughly searched for drugs, so the theory, at least initially, remained just that, a theory. However, there was one piece of evidence that no one had considered yet, one that would change the entire course of the investigation.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What was this game-changing evidence?
DNA. A DNA profile was found on the yacht, but it didn't match Sue or any of her family members. Months later, that DNA hit a match. A young woman named Megan Vass.
Megan Vass. Who was she, and how did her DNA end up on the Four Winds? This is where the story takes a really unexpected turn, right?
Yeah,
It does. And suddenly we have this new figure, Megan Vass, whose connection to Bob Chapel and the yacht is a complete mystery. What did investigators learn about her, and how did she explain her DNA being on the boat?
Well, Megan Vass was a teenager at the time, and her life was, let's just say, complicated. She was known to be homeless, struggling with drug addiction, often in trouble with the law. When questioned by the police, she initially denied ever being on the Four Winds.
So we have her DNA on the scene, but she claims she was never there. That's a pretty big contradiction. Did investigators believe her? I mean, what kind of evidence did they have to either corroborate or refute her story?
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. Remember, this was back in 2009. Technology wasn't what it is today, so pinpointing someone's whereabouts without cell phone data or readily available CCTV footage was a lot harder. The police really struggled to establish Megan's movements on the night of Bob's disappearance. Some witnesses placed her in the vicinity of the marina, while others claimed she was miles away.
So her alibi, or lack thereof, was just as shaky as Sue's. It sounds like the investigation was hitting a wall. Did the discovery of Megan's DNA shift the focus away from Sue Neal Fraser?
Not entirely. Despite this new lead, the prosecution remained convinced that Sue was responsible for Bob's disappearance. They really focused heavily on her inconsistent statements, her potential financial gain from Bob's death, and the fact that her DNA, while not at the primary crime scene, was found on items like that red jacket found nearby.
But if Megan's DNA was on the yacht, and there was no direct evidence linking Sue to any violence, how could they be so sure that Sue was the culprit? What was their theory about how the crime unfolded?
Well, their argument was built on circumstantial evidence. They proposed that Sue, motivated by financial gain or perhaps even personal grievances, had lured Bob back to the yacht and attacked him, possibly with the help of an unknown accomplice. They suggested that Megan might have been a witness to the crime or perhaps involved in the cleanup, which would explain her DNA on the boat.
It sounds like they were really trying to fit the pieces of a very complex puzzle together, and they were determined to make Sue the central piece, even with this new DNA evidence. But what about Sue's defense team? How did they respond to these allegations?
The defense argued pretty vehemently that there was no direct evidence linking Sue to the crime. They highlighted the fact that Bob's body was never found, no murder weapon was ever recovered, and the prosecution's theory really relied heavily on speculation and interpretation of Sue's actions.
So it's essentially a case of he said, she said, with both sides presenting compelling but ultimately circumstantial arguments. What was the public's reaction to all this? It sounds like a case that would captivate the nation.
It absolutely did. The trial was a media sensation, constant coverage. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some people believed that Sue was a cold-blooded killer who had very cleverly covered her tracks, while others saw her as a victim of a flawed investigation, a woman wrongly accused due to circumstantial evidence and perhaps even a touch of sexism.
It's incredible how a case like this can become so polarizing. It really speaks to the human fascination with true crime and the desire to make sense of the seemingly senseless. So what was the verdict? Did the jury believe the prosecution's case, or did they side with the defense?
Well, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Sue Neal Fraser guilty of Bob Chapel's murder. She was sentenced to 23 years in prison.
Wow. Convicted despite the lack of a body, a murder weapon, and the presence of another person's DNA at the scene. That must have been a devastating blow for Sue and her supporters. What happened next? Did she accept the verdict, or did she continue to fight for her freedom?
Sue maintained her innocence throughout the trial and beyond. Her legal team immediately began working on an appeal, and that's when the case takes another unexpected turn. Remember those new witnesses you mentioned earlier?
Yes. You mentioned two men, Stephen Gleason and Paul Rowe, who came forward with potentially incriminating information about Sue. Tell me more about them. Who were they and what did they have to say?
Okay, so Stephen Gleason was an acquaintance of both Bob and Sue. He claimed that he had seen a young woman, potentially Megan Voss, near the Four Winds on the night that Bob disappeared. This, if true, would place Megan at the scene and potentially challenge her initial denials.
Okay, so we have a witness potentially placing Megan Vass at the scene of the crime. What about Paul Rowe? How did he fit into all of this?
Paul Rowe lived on a boat moored near the Four Winds. Gleason claimed that Rowe had made threatening remarks about Bob in the past, suggesting a possible motive. Rowe, however, denied any involvement in Bob's disappearance.
So we have a potential witness to the crime and a possible new suspect with a potential motive. It sounds like the investigation was finally starting to explore some alternative theories beyond Sue's guilt. Did the police take these new leads seriously?
They did. They re-interviewed Rowe, who continued to deny any involvement but gave conflicting statements about his whereabouts that night. He also left the marina very abruptly the day after Bob's disappearance, which raised further suspicions.
It sounds like these new witness accounts were really shaking things up.
Mm.
But I remember you mentioned that there was also new forensic evidence that emerged. Tell me more about that. What did they find?
Yes. Remember that untested hair found on Sue's red jacket? Well, it finally underwent DNA testing, and it didn't belong to Sue. This was a significant development, as it further challenged the prosecution's case and strengthened Sue's claim that someone else had been on the yacht that night.
So we have a mysterious hair on Sue's jacket, new witnesses with potentially incriminating information, and a lot of unanswered questions about Megan Vass's involvement. It sounds like the case was becoming more and more complex. Did any of this lead to a breakthrough?
It did, but not in the way you might expect. Enter Colin McLaren, a former detective turned true crime author who became deeply intrigued by the Bob Chapel case.
Colin McLaren, he's a bit of a legend in the true crime world, isn't he? What drew him to this particular case, and what did he uncover?
Well, McLaren was convinced that there was more to the story than had been revealed at the trial. He was particularly interested in Megan Vass and the inconsistencies in her statements. His investigation led him to believe that she may have witnessed something crucial that night on the yacht.
So it sounds as McLaren was really digging deeper, going beyond that official investigation and following his own leads. What was the result of his deep dive into the Bob Chapel case?
Well, McLaren's investigation culminated in a bombshell revelation. He managed to get Megan Vass to sign a statutory declaration stating that she had in fact been on the Four Winds the night that Bob disappeared, but that Sue Neal Fraser was not present.
Whoa, hold on. She admits to being on the yacht, contradicting her previous denials, but she clears Sue. This completely changes the narrative. What was the reaction to this statutory declaration? Did it lead to a reopening of the case?
It was a major development, but the response from the authorities was mixed. Some saw it as potential evidence of a miscarriage of justice, but others questioned Megan's reliability as a witness, given her history of drug use and her previous conflicting statements.
So even with this new statement from Megan, there was still doubt about her credibility. Did this revelation affect Sue's appeals? Was it enough to get her a new trial?
It took years, but eventually all this new evidence, the witness statements, that untested hair, Megan's statutory declaration, and expert criticisms of the original investigation helped to secure Sue a right to appeal her conviction.
Finally, a chance to re-examine the case. Did this appeal bring Megan Vass back into the spotlight? Did they call her to testify and clarify her involvement?
They did. In 2019, she appeared on the Australian news program 60 Minutes and made a shocking confession. She claimed to have witnessed Bob Chapel's murder, stating that she was on the yacht with two men who attacked him. She even said that the sight of the blood had made her vomit, which would explain her DNA being found on the boat.
Wow. A televised confession. It seems like such a dramatic turning point in the case. Did this confession lead to Sue's release?
Unfortunately, no. While the confession seemed like a breakthrough, things quickly unraveled during the subsequent appeal hearing. Megan, appearing via video link, backtracked on her previous statements. She changed her story about how many men were present during the alleged attack and ultimately claimed she couldn't remember being on the yacht at all.
Oh no. After all that, she recants her confession. What a frustrating and confusing development. What was the reaction of Sue's legal team? And how did the court respond to this?
It was a major setback for Sue and her supporters. The prosecution, of course, seized on Megan's inconsistency, arguing that she was an unreliable witness and her previous confession couldn't be trusted. They even suggested that her DNA on the boat could have been transferred by someone else, given the number of people who had boarded the Four Winds before it was secured as a crime scene.
So despite this dramatic confession and then recantation, the case was still heavily reliant on circumstantial evidence and conflicting witness accounts. What was the outcome of the appeal?
Sadly, the appeal was dismissed and Sue remained in prison. The court, while acknowledging some weaknesses in the original investigation, ultimately ruled that there wasn't enough new evidence to warrant a retrial.
What a heartbreaking outcome after so many years of fighting for her freedom. Where does the case stand today? Is there any hope for Sue Neal Fraser to clear her name?
Sue's supporters continue to advocate for her release, highlighting that lack of direct evidence linking her to the crime and raising questions about the fairness of her trial. There are ongoing efforts to bring the case back to court. But for now, The mystery of Bob Chapel's disappearance remains unsolved.
This has been such a captivating and frustrating deep dive. We've gone through a whirlwind of evidence, suspects, and legal proceedings, and yet so many questions linger. What are your final thoughts on the Bob Chapel case? What stands out to you as the most compelling aspect of this complex story?
I think for me, it's the enduring power of uncertainty. Despite years of investigation, a trial, and multiple appeals, we still don't have a definitive answer to what happened to Bob Chappell that night. Was he the victim of a calculated murder plot? Did he accidentally fall overboard? Or was there something else at play entirely? You know, that lack of a body, the conflicting witness statements, and the ever shifting narrative, they all create a puzzle that may never be fully solved.
That's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not just a retelling of events, it's a reminder that truth can be so elusive and justice isn't always black and white. It really challenges us to think critically about the evidence that's presented, question assumptions, and grapple with the idea that sometimes there just aren't easy answers.
Exactly. And that, I think, is the takeaway for our listeners. The Bob Chappell case is a reminder that we should always remain curious, open to new information, and willing to challenge our own perspectives.
What a thought-provoking and unsettling story. It really makes you wonder what truly happened aboard the Four Winds that night.
That's a question that may haunt us for years to come. Perhaps one day new evidence will emerge, shedding light on the truth. But until then, the mystery of Bob Chappell's disappearance endures.